Hi everyone, this is going to be your Unit 4B Soils and Watersheds Test Review video. This is from Unit 4 Earth Systems and Resources from AP Environmental Science. Today what we're going to look at is properties of soil such as texture, porosity, and nutrient availability, and we'll also take a look at how watersheds function in the environment. Let's get started with a review of the rock cycle, which is going to tie directly into soil and soil formation. So there's three different types of rocks that you should be familiar with. Chances are you won't be tested on these directly on the AP exam, but some of the processes that these three types of rocks undergo are important for actual soil formation, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So let's start with sedimentary rock. It'll be something probably found closer to the surface than your other types of rock, and it's usually made up of compacted pieces of dead plants that are decaying, animals, eroded rock, and these get basically cemented together. And this often occurs through sedimentation, hence the name sedimentary rock. So let's take a look at our rock cycle on the right here. We've got a couple processes we should be familiar with. So you'll hear these terms again in just a minute, which is weathering and erosion. These are going to be processes that help break surface rock down so that they can become other types of rock. And then we have transport and deposition. So basically the pieces of rock are just making their way to another location. And in this case, you can see these pieces of rock have moved into the ocean in this picture, and they are undergoing sedimentation, or they're being compacted together and over time pushed further and deeper into the ground. So our sedimentary compacted rock, once it makes its way into the ground, is going to be subjected to burial, high temperatures, and lots of pressure because it's deep underground at this point. So being closer to the center of the earth, those processes are going to allow it to become a metamorphic type rock. And metamorphic rock is known as metamorphic because it is reshaped by heat, pressure, and chemical changes. So it literally metamorphosizes from sedimentary rock into the metamorphic rock, or a brand new type of rock. It's going to look different and have different properties internally. That metamorphic rock will melt and it could become magma. And that magma is going to eventually become our igneous rock. And igneous rock is formed from that magma cooling. Again, it changes the properties of the rock and it can be pushed out of the earth. Or it could end up coming up, you can see in this case right here, as magma out of a volcano. But as that igneous rock rises up again to the surface of the earth, the entire cycle kind of starts over again at that point. All right, before we jump into soil, we're going to need to know a few key terms that are essential for understanding the way that soil works in the environment and what its properties are. The first one is parent material, or bedrock, and this is going to be rock that is found very, very deep down in the earth, way below any kind of soil that we would typically see if we were to walk outside. And it is going to determine oftentimes the nutrient content and some of the main properties of soil. So for example, if you're in an area where there is a lot of quartz bedrock, that is going to be a soil that's probably very sandy. It's also going to have very, very low nutrients. And that bedrock is the material that is contributing to all of those properties in the soil we actually do see at the surface of the earth. We also have weathering and erosion, which I mentioned on the last slide with the rock cycle. These are two different processes. They sound kind of similar and they're easy to mix up, but they are not the same thing. So weathering is going to be your actual breaking down of that parent material that's buried deep in the earth. This can also happen on the surface as well. So you could have soil at the surface and rocks at the surface that are being weathered, but those weathering processes, they are caused by climate, by organisms, topography, so how steep an area is, for example, the type of parent material. Some parent materials are going to weather much faster than others or in different ways than others, and then also time. The more time you have, probably the more weathered something is going to be. And then we have erosion. And what erosion is kind of the breaking off of soil, not really breaking down, but it causes particles to end up moving from one place to another. And this is often driven, and you should know these two, by wind and water. So if we take a look at our beach picture over here, we can see this kind of steep hillside, and you can see that a lot of this rock kind of appears to be kind of breaking and falling in a way. That is erosion taking place. So there may be some weathering by the climate here that's causing this to weaken and break down, but eventually wind and water and rain and other processes are going to help erode this, or basically break it off of that hillside, and it will fall down and be relocated from up top to, for example, the little pile I just drew at the bottom. The next thing that we need to cover is the different physical properties of soil, one of the key ones being the texture or particle size of soil. Basically what this is how big the soil particles are. So we can see in this picture here that we've got clay on the left, silt, and then sand. And notice the particle size difference. We can see that clay is very, very small, sand is very, very large. So if we have a bowl and it is full of sand particles, we should be able to see those particles are going to be very, very big. They're going to be loose. A lot of airspace will be between them. If we were to have a bowl of clay particles, those clay particles would be very tiny, very compacted together. And we would probably not see much space between the particles at all. We can also have mixtures of these three different types, and this is actually what determines soil type. And we'll look at this a little more in a minute. You might remember the soil texture triangle from class, where you had to determine the different percentages of soil type, so percentage of clay, silt, and sand, and then determine the actual type of soil, for example, a silty loam. These different particles have a couple key properties that we need to know about for AP Environmental Science. Porosity is one of them, which is basically how quickly the soil is going to drain a liquid through it. So if we had a big glass full of sand and we were to pour liquid into that sand, it would drain from the top through the bottom very, very quickly. If we had a glass full of clay, though, those clay particles are very, very tiny. So if we were to pour water into it and allow it to drain, it would probably take an incredibly long time. Most likely, we would see that water just sitting on top of that clay, not really draining through it because those particles are very, very small, very compacted together, and are not going to allow liquids to drain through. So we would say, for example, that clay, being the smallest, most compacted together particle, is going to be the slowest draining and has low porosity. Silt would be kind of in between clay and sand, and then we would say sand is going to be our largest particle size and also fastest draining or high porosity. So let's take a look at that soil texture triangle that I mentioned on the last slide. This allows us to determine the type of soil we're actually dealing with, so we give it a name. And this is based on the percentage of clay, silt, and sand found in that soil. All right, so let's take a look at how we would determine the soil texture based on using the triangle here. Now, on an AP exam, you would be given this triangle, so there's no memorizing it. Let's start with our first example. We have 50% clay, 30% silt, and 20% sand. So what we could do is start with any of those percentages. I like to start with clay and work my way around kind of clockwise, just because to me it makes more sense. Really though, you can start with percent silt or percent sand, it'll work exactly the same. So let's start with our 50% clay. So what I like to do to make sure I'm using the right line, and what I mean by line is all of these little crossing lines forming the triangles inside of the big triangle. To make sure I'm using the right one, I underline the number I'm looking for. And notice when I underline it, it makes a horizontal line. So that means I'm going to be using this horizontal line right here. And the reason that's important is if you look at that 50%, it also has a line coming off of it kind of at a downward angle. We don't want to use that one. And that is not the correct line because that's actually lining up with the silt percentage. So this is part of why I like to draw that line under the 50%. To remind me that I should be using the horizontal line. So I drew my horizontal line here, that's 50% clay. Now let's go look at silt. So silt is at 30%. So 30%, if we draw a line under the 30, notice it's now at an angle. So we're going to use that same angle line, so this one right here, to show us the 30% silt. And notice that angle has kind of the same angle that we just drew for the line under the 30. Now these are already intersecting right here. But you should always check your last percentage. In this case, 20% sand. There's my line under the 20. This line follows the same angle. And notice that it does intersect in the same spot. So in this case, this point intersects here, and we have clay as our soil type. So we would write that down as our answer. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this example 2 right here. So 30% clay. You could come down here, start with 30%. Remember, it's horizontal, so we follow that across. Then 20% silt, follow that down at the same angle the number is angled at. And then we have 50% sand. And we follow that again, same angle the number is at. And we can say that this one falls in sandy clay loam, and that would be our answer. So now that we know a little bit about soil properties, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the tests that you might have done in lab and class for review. Sometimes these are referenced on the test, so you're going to want to be familiar with them. So the first one is doing a soil texture and type test, and we put a soil sample in, mix it with water, but it'll settle them out into 3 different layers in that jar. Remember that sand is big and heavy, so it's going to fall down to the bottom of the jar first. So let's say that we mixed up our soil sample in my little beaker over here on the right, and when we settled it out, we get a layer of sand that sinks to the bottom. And that sand is usually going to sink really fast. Remember, they're big, heavy particles. All right, and then after some time, usually this takes maybe 30 minutes if you're doing this in class, you're going to get a layer of silt that's going to settle on top of that sand. Remember, silt is kind of the in-between particle size. And then if we're doing this lab in class, this last step, the clay that settles out, this can sometimes take overnight. And that is because clay particles, there's some terrible letters there, sorry about that. Those clay particles take a very, very long time to settle. And so the clay particles, when they do settle out, are going to be on the very top of this. And this is also sometimes why we use, again, that flocculating agent or a chemical to help that clay stick together and settle. But now if we look at our settling test that we just did, we can see that there are very clear layers and measurable layers. And this is where this test is very useful for determining soil type. If we wanted to determine soil type from this, what we would do is we would measure top to bottom. So let's say in this case, we got 10 centimeters. And I'm going to use 10 just to make the math easy on this. Then what we would do is we would measure just up to the sand. And let's say that this one ended up being 6 centimeters. Well, 6 centimeters out of 10 centimeters is 60% of that total height. So that means our sand that we have is actually 60% of our soil content. So we could use our triangle now to determine 60% sand, but we need more than just one to be able to really determine what it is. So the next thing we would do is measure our silt content. And let's say that this one was 3 centimeters. Well, 3 centimeters of the 10 is going to be 30%. So that 30%, we could also, again, look up on the triangle. And then our last one, let's say that this is only 1 centimeter for the clay. So that 1 centimeter for the clay is going to be our 10%. So we have 60% sand, 30% silt, and 10% clay. We can now put this on the triangle and determine what type of soil we have. Other common types of tests that you might run in a lab in class or even scientists might use in the field would be tests to determine the nitrogen and phosphorus amounts within the soil, because this is going to determine the amount of nutrients available for plant growth. We might also test porosity, so we might set up a chamber that allows us to put a soil sample in it and then drain water through that soil from top to bottom, and we would time how long it takes for the water to stop draining. So if there was a high sand content for that soil, it would drain very, very fast. With a high clay content, though, it will drain very, very, very slowly, and that is because clay is super tiny, there's very little air between the particles, and it packs very closely together. And the last thing that we need to know with these tests is that they can help us determine irrigation, so watering needs, and also fertilization needs. So do we need to add artificial fertilizer to the soil? Let's say we're a farmer and we're trying to determine how often do I need to water my plants? How often do I need to apply fertilizer? How much fertilizer do I need to apply? So these can be applied within something like an agricultural field so that we can determine how to keep our crops healthy. The last thing with soil that you should be familiar with is soil horizons. Often on previous AP exams, they have shown a picture of the soil horizon that you see over on the right and asked you to identify a specific layer. So I'm going to teach you a way to do that. But before we do that, let's go through the types of layers that we see. The first one is the O horizon, and the O horizon is O for organic. So it is going to be made up of the layer on top of any kind of loose, what we would consider soil, and it is going to be like decomposing leaves, maybe dead animals breaking down, any kind of organic decomposing matter. The next layer down is going to be A. This is our topsoil. It's going to be a mixture of that organic material that's already decomposed mixed in with minerals that have originated ultimately from the bedrock deep, deep down in the earth. Sometimes we can have an E layer as well. And that E layer is known as the alluviation layer. It is where when we have water percolate down through the soil, it often is going to dissolve minerals. Remember, water is a universal solvent. It picks up and dissolves a lot of stuff in it. And then we can sometimes get a layer of those dissolved minerals in the soil, and that gives us that E layer. Sometimes it appears like kind of a very thin white layer within these layers of soil. So if you were able to dig down deep in the earth and view this soil horizontally, like we see it in this picture here, you might see kind of a thin, almost crust of minerals between that A and B layer. The B layer is going to be our subsoil. It's mostly minerals, not really a lot of organics mixed in there. Most of the organics are in the topsoil. We have our C layer, which is going to be our weathered subsoil. Sometimes it's referred to as a substratum. And then all of that is actually weathering from the R horizon or R layer, which is our bedrock. So this could be a quartz layer, a limestone layer, or some other type of material that's going to make up the primary properties of this soil. So the way that I teach my students to remember this is the phrase, only ants eat breadcrumbs regularly. So O, A, E, B, C, and R. Okay, you got to remember that R is for rock, but other than that, we have O for organics, then our A horizon, our E for alluviation layer, our B horizon, our C horizon, and then we hit again the R layer or bedrock. So only ants eat breadcrumbs regularly. Just remember that that's in order, top to bottom, and if you're given this picture on the test, you should be able to pick out that letter based on which layer it's in. Okay, on to the last thing for this review video. We need to know about watersheds. Now, watersheds are going to be all the land that drains to a particular stream, river, lake, or wetland. So in this case, I'm using the Mississippi watershed. Now, the Mississippi watershed is actually made up of a bunch of rivers that go out across the United States that all contribute to the main part of the Mississippi. So if you notice that there's the pink, the purple, the darker blue, the lighter blue, all of these different watersheds all feeding into the main Mississippi watershed. So the line that I just drew on there is the main part of the Mississippi. And what's going to happen is water from these watersheds is going to run off the land and make its way to their individual rivers. And all of these rivers feed toward the Mississippi River. So that's the main part of the watershed there. So runoff is, again, that water moving across the land into the water body. So it can carry a lot of nutrients and other things with it that are not necessarily the best for the environment. So toxins, other things on the land like bacteria. So this can actually be an environmental problem. And one of the things that they do like to focus on the AP exam is environmental problems and solutions. So this particular problem, let's say that we're talking about fertilizer in runoff. Well, fertilizer is high in either nitrogen or phosphorus, depending on what kind of fertilizer is being used. So let's say that all these areas, and we know the middle of the United States is a big area for agriculture, but all these areas are fertilizing. Extra fertilizer is going to run off, again, into that watershed. All of this kind of gets dumped into the Mississippi River itself. Well, the Mississippi actually dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So this drainage area that leads out to the Gulf of Mexico, any water that contains these nutrients drains that way, carries those nutrients with it. Well, these nutrients, as we know, cause eutrophication. And eutrophication is an algae overgrowth caused by basically easy access to their food, to the nitrogen and phosphorus. So what will happen with eutrophication is algae will overgrow. They will eventually die and decay, but as they do that, they eat up oxygen, and we can get something called a hypoxic or sometimes a dead zone. This is basically an area where there's not enough oxygen in the water for organisms to survive successfully. And this can be a really big problem. You can end up with areas that are just totally hypoxic, totally lacking in oxygen. So some solutions for this might be to regulate fertilizer use within farmlands. So maybe having a government or state regulation to control the amount of fertilizer put onto the land. We could use what's called BMP, or best management practices in farming, which would be things like maybe using low-till farming so there's not as much erosion of soil, which can also carry nutrients with it. Maybe using cover crops to try to keep soil in place also helps prevent nutrients from ending up in runoff. We could make sure that we're using proper irrigation techniques as well, maybe a drip irrigation as opposed to a flood irrigation or a furrow irrigation. Public education for home fertilizer use would be another great solution. This is something that's helped out along with the best management practices in South Florida, where they were having a lot of problems with eutrophication in the Everglades. So they implemented these practices in the agricultural areas, making sure less fertilizer is being used. They help educate people about using proper amounts of fertilizer around their homes and helping to prevent runoff. And all of this helped decline the amount of nutrients, and it has been a multi-decade process, but they have started to see some turnaround and less eutrophication occurring in that area. Our third option is another thing they have actually used in the Everglades as well, which is tertiary water treatment. This is using one of two things. You could either use at an actual water treatment facility a process that is going to help remove nutrients from the water, or a really unique process which is setting up constructed wetlands. And these constructed wetlands can be used to help absorb these nutrients before that water is released into an area. So they have done this below Lake Okeechobee, which is kind of the eye-shaped lake in South Florida, to help bring in water that may contain a lot of nutrients. Plants in those constructed wetlands then process out those nutrients, and then that water is released into the Everglades, much cleaner and not containing the same amount of nutrients that were causing eutrophication issues previously. Thank you for watching the Unit 4B review on soils and watersheds.